Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I'm also the managing editor at DevOps.com. Today's event is going to be, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We have a great topic here, and we're going to have some great conversations. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of today's event, you will receive a link to the webinar post-event so that you can listen to it on demand. And also, we are taking questions from the audience, so at any time today during our discussion, if you have a question, please use that control panel when submit your questions, and we'll take hopefully 15 minutes or so near the end of the event to go over the questions. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is 7 all too common barriers to successful DevOps transformation and how to overcome them. This webinar today is a follow-on to an ebook that we have available, and everybody who did register for today's event is going to receive a link to the ebook after the event. The ebook is also available on the DevOps.com website in the library. We also have an extensive selection of ebooks on pretty much every topic related to DevOps, so please go check it out there as well. Our speaker today is TJ Randall, and there we go, who's Vice President of Customer Success at Zebia Labs. Welcome, TJ. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited about the topics we're going to discuss.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Well, TJ, I know your short bio is right up here on the screen for everybody to read, but why don't we start out by you just kind of telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, Vice President of Customer Success, I'm responsible for all things post-sales here at Zebia Labs. So if you really think about the customer journey, really, myself and my team start right after the customers join us. And I like to joke, I like to say we get to do DevOps for real, because customer success, we are part of that journey. So it's not just about like implementation and training. That's a key part of what we do. But it's also like making sure that customers can actually transform their organizations. So this, as we all know, DevOps is a journey, right? It's not just a finish line. So I'm pretty lucky in my position that we get to run a team that gets to be part of this like critical transformation.
Excellent. All right, great. Well, today's topic, as I said, is the 7 all too common barriers to successful DevOps transformation. And you can see a copy of the ebook right there. Really at the end of the day, what we're looking at is why companies fail when it comes to DevOps. What's kind of standing in their way? So hopefully the audience today will come away with at least one thing out of the 7 that they can think about, take with them, and try and help their organization. So let's take a look at some of those common barriers and kind of go through them. Why don't you go ahead and take it from here, the software delivery?
Sure. So, I mean, as we know, and the folks on the webinar will speak to, is that dev teams are being pressured to balance a lot of things, right? So this DevOps transformation, what it really means at the end of the day is, you have developers who are trying to balance customer demands as well as feature requests, enhancements, and then there's fixes, et cetera. So they're delivering a lot of different changes within their organization. So the topics that we picked for the ebook are important to make sure that we understand the entire software delivery process, right? So when we ask why is software delivery a key indicator of success, well, it's critical for people to understand that consistent delivery of software means a lot of things. So it speaks to the confidence that your customer has in you to deliver features and enhancements. It also provides like a better customer experience, right? So as your website being up is critical to your business as well as your customers having a good experience within your organization. And then, of course, there's the other side of it as well, which is staying ahead of the competition. Most companies today are software companies, whether they like that or not. So software delivery now has become such a critical factor in making sure that an organization can be successful. And so the topics that we're going to talk to today really speak to this DevOps transformation And a lot of the ebook really does focus on the people process side of things, right? We always say DevOps is people process tools. Well, unfortunately, what I tend to see a lot in the work that I do is that most of the focus is on the tools side of things. So what we really want to be able to do today, and as well as the ebook, is provide insights into how we address the people process side of DevOps.
Okay, great. Whoops, I think I did the wrong one. Sorry about that. So barrier number one, development teams are resistant to change. Now, this, you just mentioned the culture side, people and processes. To me, culture is hands down the biggest barrier, because culture spreads over people, culture spreads over processes, culture spreads even over tools. So, how is it that a company can change the culture of its people, processes, and tools to really adopt this DevOps? And that resistance to change is that's got to be one of the toughest things in helping push that culture toward a DevOps mindset.
You're exactly right. It's the culture is really that key aspect, and right, it's that people in the process side, the hard part of DevOps. One of the hallmarks that I see right out of the gate in the organizations that I've been at, where they've had a very successful transition onto this more modern delivery, this DevOps transformation, is executive level commitment. I mean, that's just a key. It's like a key hallmark to see if you're actually going to be successful. And really, why that's so critical is it's not executive level telling folks what to do. It's really this executive level sponsorship that helps provide the guidance and the training that the teams need as they change, right? Because most organizations today, they're not running one type of, particular technology stack. A lot of organizations have a lot of different technologies and different teams, and they have teams and people at different stages in this more modern IT delivery. So really addressing, things like skill gaps. So it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to do DevOps, right? And we're going to start this initiative. But then getting down to the level to say, okay, with the staff that we have, with the teams that are actually trying to solve these problems, where do we have gaps? What types of skills do these teams need to modernize their delivery process? And I think a big part of this first barrier, this development team's resistance to change, one thing I see for organizations that struggle is you get this kind of weird top-down kind of directive strategy for implementing DevOps. And the reason why that fails is that the development teams aren't able to express what they need as part of a delivery pipeline. They're not, for one, they're probably not going to get the solution that they need to be successful. So their resistance to change is really the fact that they recognize, like, hey, the things that we've decided to implement aren't going to work for us in the first place. And it's always unfortunate, right? That causes a lot of frustration in the organization, and people don't feel like they have the voice at the table. So I think a huge part of that change, that resistance, is, it has to be addressed as part of the overall solution.
Do you think that there's also a resistance to change coming from management? Like the management is saying you must do this, and so people, being natural rebels, they're like, well, you tell me, but I'm not going to do it. Or or upper management says we need to move to DevOps, we're going to move to DevOps, and then that's it. That's the last you ever hear about it from management. Does it need to be an ongoing conversation?
Yeah, I think that's the key word, right? It's ongoing. It's, this, as I said a little earlier, there's no finish line to this. What it really is basically setting up patterns for your different teams across your organization to find those patterns in which to modernize their delivery. A very common conversation I tend to have is you say, well, we have these legacy applications out there. Like, how are they supposed to modernize? Well, what's interesting about that is even if you go to those teams, and by the way, we have a customer, they don't call them legacy applications, they call them mature applications. I like that a lot better.
I like that too.
I'm a mature IT guy, So even going to these more mature application teams and saying, what does it look like to modernize your delivery process? And first and foremost, what you'll find is most of the time, they aren't necessarily included in these more modern conversations. I'm saying that in quotes. And the other part of it is actually a lot of times modernizing those types of applications is basically setting up a consistent structure. So now all of a sudden, like these application teams that maybe only deploy every quarter, they have a much more consistent structure in which they're going to deliver their application changes. And having that input by the dev team, that's, that breaks down that barrier, that resistance to change.
Okay. All right. Great. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second one here, which is operations teams are resistant to change.
We have resistance everywhere, don't we?
Yeah. I mean, do you think they're more resistant than developers or less?
It's funny. I don't think of it as a more or less thing. I mean, again, it depends on the situation, but it's interesting in terms of their roles, right? So developers, their job is to get changes into production as quickly as possible, right? There's a lot of pressure. They have to deliver changes as fast as possible. And really, to summarize operations, they're trying to manage risk of change, right? They have to keep the lights on. So I think a lot of times when they hear things like, hey, we're going to modernize and automate everything, you can imagine it gets pretty nerve-wracking pretty quickly because they have rules and regulations they have to follow. And so I think from a feeling of that resistance to change, I think that's where that tends to come up, is the operations team saying, hey, we have non-negotiable requirements that we have to fulfill as part of our, regulated environment, for example. So when you're talking about automation, you still need to consider those things.
So do you think that they're also resistant because maybe they feel like their job is at stake if developers are kind of encroaching into their space, per se?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And we actually had a funny situation one time. We were finishing up a implementation, and one of the operations folks turned to his manager and said, hey, when we turn this on, for real in production, what am I going to do? And the manager said, the job I hired you for. And the reason why I think that's kind of funny is I think that's true in a lot of organizations. You have operations people doing things that they weren't necessarily, that wasn't in their original job description, but somebody's got to do it, right? Somebody has to do it to keep the lights on. And so modernizing the delivery process, that's why it's so key to get them as part of the conversation, right? Helping folks understand, what does operations need in order to accept the change? And by doing that, right, then even the operations folks can see, hey, I'm getting to improve my skill sets as well. Imagine every cloud initiative out there, every company moving to the cloud. All of a sudden, your operations people are taking on new job roles and responsibilities as part of this overall modernization. And I think that makes it more exciting for them to actually accept that change.
Yeah, I wonder with, so many operations people right now just basically putting out fires and being more reactive than, having something like this happen where that totally changes their job dynamic. I wonder if they even really know what their job is anymore. It's kind of they have to take a step back and say, wait a minute, okay.
Right. They might actually get nervous if we get a 90%, delivery rate for our applications, right? So all of a sudden they say something must be wrong.
Something must be wrong, exactly.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the one thing that I see more and more often is that the operations type role, that traditional type role, is being moved into new titles. So a common title that I see an awful lot is site reliability engineer, because now you have these folks that are quote operations, but they're now a site is no longer a data center somewhere, right? It's a mixture. It's virtual environments, it's cloud, it's data center, and so site reliability is actually even more critical to an organization than before. So I see in a lot of opportunity for the kind of the operations side of the house to really start to build out their careers and build their skill sets for what they can do.
Interesting. All right, great. Well, moving along to the third barrier, if you're not ops, you're dev. So it would really be interesting to me if colleges and universities started actually offering DevOps degrees and because right now there's devs and there's ops, and I don't think that people have really gotten to the point yet where the two actually can be one, or the two should work together, or whatever it takes from a mindset to make DevOps kind of flow through the organization.
That's right. Yeah. And understanding what does automation really mean and integrations mean, right? A lot of technical people, that has actually, at least for the more, mature, IT folks, sometimes that's even a change in the way they're thinking of doing things, right? Instead of doing things a lot in a more manual way, automation actually requires you to think about the problems differently. And you're right, like what would a DevOps degree look like? Well, it would probably look like somebody who's not only comfortable with the more modern IT stack, but they're also comfortable like moving applications around, delivering changes in a much more modern automated way.
So right now, what is, when we say if you're not ops, you're dev, what do you kind of consider to be that barrier there? Is it more of a mindset, or is it a skill set, or what do you think there?
What I think of it, so a lot of times when I talk with organizations, we want to make sure the focus is on the entire delivery pipeline, right? The dev to prod pipeline. We say that an awful lot. And of course, the reason why that's important is because applications in most large enterprises don't just go from dev to prod, right? There's no one swim lane where it quickly goes back and forth. What happens in most organizations, even as they modernize, their applications are traveling across multiple environments. So what this really requires, the word, I feel like it gets overused a lot, but this is where like your empathy comes into play, because the title here is really trying to call out that says it's not a barrier in the middle. Like there's all these different teams that are responsible for delivering the application. And the key to success is being able to say, hey, if I understand my job, let's say I'm on development, but what does Charlene have to do on her side when she accepts an application change? And talking to those different folks and really getting an understanding of what they're responsible for in terms of application delivery, it's critical. Because then that way you're breaking down that wall. It's not just like me taking a change and throwing over the wall. It's me thinking about what happens when I deliver that change.
Okay, so it's a level of understanding that may not be there right now.
That's right. And it definitely ties, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
No, I was agreeing and meant to, as we've even been talking about before, which is that level of understanding in terms of what do people need to do their job? What do they need in order to be successful? Those are kind of topics that people don't necessarily think about when they're talking about DevOps.
Yeah. Okay. So, and it's not just when you say what they need to do their jobs. It's not just the tools. It's the entire process. I mean, it's beyond just kind of a checklist. It kind of has to, its interaction is key in this respect as well.
Exactly. I mean, I'll give an example is a lot of larger companies that we deal with, they'll have this concept of stage. Right? It's just before production. It's a production-like environment. And what's interesting about the attributes of that environment is that's where, for example, the business might come in and test and validate. Or, your project teams, like your release managers are in there with the BAs, and they're making sure that everything, all the requirements are fulfilled. Even if we're doing more agile development, right? It's kind of like the sanity check for prod. Mm-hmm. So if you have one of those environments, your developers need to understand what does it take to get into that environment, for example. What is it, not just the binary pieces, that's the easy part, but what else has to be done in the organization just to get started work in this stage environment? And then also, what do I need to complete it? So, for example, a lot of heavily regulated environments, they actually have to provide reporting there, what changed, what's coming into the release to prod, all those types of things. And then the other one that I like to call out personally is what happens day to day inside of that environment. So imagine a situation where we had to have business testers come into the stage environment for a week, and they needed to do kind of training and validation, which seems to be pretty common in a lot of companies. Well, developers should understand that says, hey, if I don't deliver my application correctly into that environment, now I'm impacting people's work schedules. Now they have to reshuffle resources to get people in there. So there's a lot of things that people should be aware of that usually aren't talked about when we talk about DevOps, right? We just think, hey, move faster. But there's a lot of impact to that speed as well.
So within this then, you're talking about the testing or the staging environment, kind of made me think about this. we talk about DevOps kind of being a company-wide initiative. It's not developers. It's not just developers. It's not IT operations. It's pretty much everybody in the company being involved. So, we're talking about creating applications and services and processes. Where do the stakeholders actually fit into the process? I mean, do they have a piece of the pie, if you will, at the beginning of the process, or is it something that they need to be involved in at the staging process, or where do you see them fitting in?
That's a great question, and you're actually foreshadowing too, which is nice. We're going to get to that in a minute. No, that's great. It's great. I mean, a big part of that is the stakeholders should be right in the middle of it. So I use that example sometimes. Is everybody talks about metrics, right? Oh, we need metrics. We got to measure, which is true. But if you get, I've seen this at other customers where the CIO would actually say, why did it take, X number of commits for a developer to get the code right? If your CIO is talking in terms of code commits, there's something wrong with your metrics, right? You're measuring something, but it's not necessarily what we should be talking about. So I think your stakeholders are involved in the entire process. They're one of the ones that have a voice at the table in terms of what we need to create as part of this DevOps transformation. And then, as you just said, they need to be actively involved in that day-to-day as well. So it's not enough for your CIO to say, hey, we're doing a DevOps. They also have to do things like, this is an example. I was at a customer last week where the development teams would present, they would create these PDF reports, and that's what got emailed out to the different teams at the end of the week, like, hey, here's what we delivered this week. From that point forward, moving forward, they built an automated solution that said, look, that report is online. And so when we have that conversation as an organization about what got delivered, we all have to use the central portal. It's no longer acceptable for people to create custom reports. So I thought that was an interesting example that said, hey, even the CIO has to change the way he or she consumes information. They have to be part of it as well.
And that also goes back to the earlier barrier, which is, making sure that the executive management has, they've given you total buy-in and they're a part of the process as well. That's really interesting.
Yep, for sure. And then again, once they have buy-in, now they have to feel a little of the pressure of that change as well. And as you can imagine, when we talk about resistance to change, you can see each person in this pipeline would have some sort of resistance for some reason. So we have to include that. We need to understand what is that resistance about. And what I find most of the time, the resistance really isn't to the change itself. It's almost like the ability to express, how am I going to do my job in this new way?
Right.
So I understand how to do it today, but now we're going to do this cool new DevOps thing. When we're moving in that new mode, how do I do my job? And, how am I going to deliver what I'm responsible for? So I think that's really important to talk in those terms.
Yeah, and that I would imagine would be an ongoing discussion. I mean, because I would think that most companies kind of dive into DevOps with certain ideas in mind, regarding how it's going to improve their processes. But what those processes are is kind of up there in the ether, and there's no roadmap for a lot of companies when they talk about how jobs are going to change. And so, I imagine it's a learning process. It's,
You're exactly right. And that's why DevOps it tends to map so well with agile type thinking, right? It's that feedback loop. So there's nothing wrong with an organization as it's going through its DevOps transformation, this long running transformation, to have feedback cycles. And to, to have checkpoints where you're saying, hey, these are the changes we've made. Is this working? Is it applicable to the next set of teams that are going to be moving into this new model? If not, how do we self-correct, et cetera? So that's another, common thing. I think we've all been there in the large organization where they say we're going to change how we do things. And one of the things that tends to be missing is it's like that all or nothing, which is really, as we know, there's a reason why the world tends to move away from waterfalls towards more agile type delivery, because having that feedback loop is so important to understand. Am I on track? Are we doing what we said we were going to do? What needs to change?
Right. There's nothing more frustrating than saying something is going to happen and then never actually seeing it happen.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. Exactly.
All right, then we'll go ahead and move on to the next barrier here, which is the continuous delivery pipeline only applies to a small set of the application stack. Well, that's a bunch of hooey. We both know that, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. It always solves all the problems for everything. This is actually this is the thing, I mean, we all see it in all different types of conversations. You read a lot about it, and it's the fact that something gets built and it seems like that's the right approach, and then all of a sudden other teams start to chime in and they're like, well, we can't use that either because of the technology we use, or that solution only, addresses a very small subset of the overall delivery problem.
So what can be done to kind of remediate this then?
I've seen a couple different things. One thing that I find very interesting is most customers that we have, and most organizations that we've talked to, the concept of having like an architecture board feels really dated. Like, oh yeah, the developers got to go to the architecture board to get their blessing for the different tools that they want to bring. What I'm seeing more with these organizations that are very successful with their DevOps transformation, it's having this concept of a center of excellence. And really what that, the COE is doing is they're the ones that are defining best practices, right? They're basically doing studies and they're talking about what are the preferred tools, but they're not necessarily a limiting agency. Meaning, if a development team comes along and they have to solve some new problem for the company and they want to use some new technology, the Center of Excellence is a great place to go bounce your ideas off of how you want to deliver that. But in no way should that be the total restrictive entity that says, well, you can't go down that path. So finding like the Center of Excellence concept, I'm seeing actually works quite well, especially for like larger organizations where they have a lot of different applications and technology stacks, a lot of different tools. But that works well because, the Center of Excellence almost has that view of the entire company, like the landscape, and they can really actually now start to provide very good guidance to teams as well. Because you'll have teams that don't even, they're just starting out on this journey and they're like, well, I don't even really know where to get started. So now you have a place that's relevant to your organization that you can have that conversation. Like, hey, we're going to start, setting up continuous integration with our application. We've never done that before. What are other teams out there doing? Providing that central, voice for a customer, actually, I see it actually in a very successful way.
So what about shadow IT though? Because that's been a problem for a lot of organizations as they, especially, and I would actually contend that actually might be a barrier. Is these people listening, people in the company who they don't see. They don't have a center of excellence, or they don't have an IT department that is very responsive to their needs when they need to maybe spin up something on the cloud, a cloud instance quickly to be able to do something, and they just go and do it themselves. So, how do you kind of rein that in? And what about also those folks who maybe go to a center of excellence? They suggest some things. They don't like what they hear from the Center of Excellence, so they go and do it anyway, whatever they want to do. So, how do you deal with those folks?
It's funny, isn't it, that the minute you mention like a thing like Center of Excellence, everyone kind of, hopefully not everyone, but people hear like, oh my goodness, it must take 4 months to get that approval.
Yeah, right.
But at the same time, we're trying to implement like this DevOps modernization where we want to deliver applications faster. So part of the answer, I think, is the fact of, if you're going to put a process in place, it has to be just as efficient as moving code, right? You can't put in something cumbersome and expect people to really like latch onto it and use that. Again, we get back to resistance to change, right? And you're right, shadow IT, it actually is more of a barrier than anything else, because what will happen is, in a lot of organizations, teams go back, they say, heck, I'm going to solve it myself. Well, they tend to solve it, for one, locally, and two, not across the entire pipeline. So you start getting into even more trouble because now you're like, well, I did X, Y, Z, and I can do it fine in development, and then I'll just hand it off to the QA team, and they can figure out how they want to deploy that. That's, obviously a problem, because now all of a sudden now you have different delivery patterns. So instead of modernizing, you're really moving backwards. And to your point, that can be a significant barrier just in kind of that behavior of the people and how they're trying to solve problems.
So is it then a question to kind of maybe prevent that from happening in the future, or at least, reduce the amount of the number of times it happens? Does that involve perhaps kind of changing the overall culture of the environment, whether it be a center of excellence or the IT department, to kind of be more responsive and be more open to the suggestions and just even the conversations that folks are having?
Exactly. Right. You want to keep your conversations as natural and flowing as possible, whether that has to do with spinning up new environments or taking on new technology. And I think you're exactly right. It's so important for teams to be able to express those types of things. So especially if you're sitting in the executive level and you start hearing people say, man, we set up the center of excellence and it's taking me 3 months to get a change approved. Mm-hmm. That's a job of the management kind of level to hear that and say, wait a minute, we're actually we're putting in barriers rather than, freeways. That sounds kind of corny, but, mm-hmm. We want to make it, at the end of the day, we want to enable developers to deliver to production as quickly and safely as possible, right? They want to get their changes running in Claude, and we want to manage that risk. So whether it's a center of excellence, whether it's actually creating pipelines that developers follow, predefined pipelines that are, certified, all these different concepts, to your point, still have to follow, the pattern of, quickly, efficiently, but also making sure you're meeting the goals of the organization. Okay.
So actually, do you mind if we talk a little bit about the centers of excellence, that whole idea, and maybe, if a company is interested in looking into doing a center of excellence, what are some of the basics there that they need to know about it? I mean, who would be a member of the center of excellence, and how often would they meet? Is it like a formal thing, or can you kind of just walk us through that a little bit? Do you mind?
Sure. Pretty much what I've seen so far, this kind of center of excellence concept, it's generally made up of your lead developers or your architects, the people that understand not just the local problem of, one application or two applications. It's also understanding how do these applications fit into the overall organization. So whatever their titles tend to be, those are the folks that can basically, they're working at a company. They can talk a lot about the different technology stacks. They can talk about what the different teams are doing. So they have, they're the type of people that kind of rise up and they have a better vision of the field, so to speak. And what's funny about it is the last two customers that I was working with that implemented this model both forgot to invite teams like the database team and the QA team. So, and it was kind of funny because it happened twice in a row. That was odd enough, but in a way, isn't it? You have different people that work in quote IT, but they're not necessarily part of the conversation of this DevOps, this modernization. And I don't know why the DBAs tend to get left out or the QA folks, but not to pick on them. But when you talk about a center of excellence, those are the people that you want there as well. Because if you're going to talk about topics like best practice, those are the people that can give direct input that, again, they're thinking more across the organization. So you don't need somebody like analyzing SQL scripts, but you do need a database person to say, hey, if we automate these things, here's what it's going to impact. Again, they're more of a sounding board. The hallmark of a successful center of excellence, I think, is that they're more of a sounding board than a regulatory agency, right? They're not saying yes or no per se. What they're trying to do is guide people on best practice. And then the one other thing you asked is how often do they meet? What I find in most organizations, they're actually already kind of self-organizing. These are people that are already, having these conversations. And so what they're able to do is create something that is very efficient. Like you don't need to have a formal board where people show up on Thursday afternoon. You can set up a process. One company that we have is they use Jira for that. But, all the members of the architecture board, log in, they can see it, they can sound up, in on their particular viewpoint, and that's it. So it's just as easy as, opening a ticket if you're going to make a change in prod as to, submit a request to the COE and say, hey guys, I'm thinking of doing, this particular technology, and, this is new to the organization. What do you guys think? So again, creating conversation and letting people express not only what they need to accomplish, but also, being able to provide feedback on what does the organization look at as best practice. As long as it's a conversation, I think that's where the success comes in.
Okay. And the COE is an ongoing thing, right? It's not just like a one shot, these are the tools you need to use, and then, never hear from them again. Okay.
Exactly. Until the next tool comes in, and then no. Isn't it funny? You said that about shadow IT. A lot of times, that's where I tend to see shadow IT kind of pop up. Is you have a development team and they're on some kind of new project. So it might be like new technology that the company hasn't used before. And in that way, that's a little harder, right? So now all of a sudden you have to have a conversation and say, hey, we want to bring in this new stack, and this is what it would look like. And this is why we're not going to use some of our existing investments. But that's a good conversation to have, because now it's like kind of sounding those things out. And it's allowing people to give their different viewpoints, et cetera. And I think if you're able to do that in a more efficient way, and you're not creating an organization that just is like, no, we don't do it that way. We do it the old way. That's where you're going to start to eliminate a lot of that shadow IT.
Yeah, and I think if people understand the motivation or the reasoning why certain decisions are made, I think they're a lot more prone to kind of working as a team rather than kind of striking out on their own. It's like, don't tell me I can't do it. Tell me why I can't do it. So
yeah.
Okay. All right. Great.
And isn't it funny too? Is half the time in life, pull out of DevOps. Don't we all wish sometimes when we want to start something new, we could bounce that off somebody and say, "Hey, I'm about to do this. What what are your experiences there?" Because again, you may or may not decide to do it, but it's always nice to get that feedback from people who have worked through those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's building that knowledge base, I think, is critical. Because there's no value in reinventing the wheel, right?
Precisely.
All right, great. Well, we're moving rapidly along. We've gotten some great questions in so far, but there is time. If you have a question for TJ about any of this so far, please go ahead and use that control panel, submit your questions. And as we get near the end here, we'll go ahead and take a look at the questions. Let's move on to our next barrier, which is barrier number 5, continuous delivery pipelines not planned to be enterprise grade. Boy, there is nothing more frustrating than using something that it's like fitting a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And I think when we think, I wonder when we're talking about this, how often people see the word enterprise grade and they cringe a little, like, oh boy, I smell more process coming. But isn't it amazing? Like I'll use CI tools for an example. It's amazing how in an organization that'll grow organically. So you have a dev team, they're trying to solve how to move towards, continuous integration, right? Building their applications more safely, more securely. So they start implementing tools there, but those tools aren't nobody talks to somebody in operations and says, hey, I need to run this. And what ends up happening, I see this an awful lot, is the team is successful, right? They build something that actually really works, except there's no service level for the particular server or machine that CI tool is now running on. So all of a sudden, later on, if there's a problem, like, the machine's under somebody's desk and then it accidentally gets shut down, now you're blocking the dev team from actually delivering changes. And it sounds silly, but it actually happens more often than you think. So in my mind, enterprise grade really means that says, hey, if we're going to invest in a solution, if we're going to, it's a part of our DevOps vision in order to do things more efficiently, that's where the conversation comes in with like your network services teams. You say, hey, I need to provide these things in more of a service model. I need to ensure that these things are up and running so that the different teams can take advantage of them. There's no, in most organizations, there's no longer like, blackout weekends and all those fun things. Developers are working around the globe 24 hours a day. So all of a sudden your CI server needs to be available for those times. And to me, that's an important conversation as part of this we talk about people, process, tools. If you think about your continuous delivery pipeline, think about the people, the process, and the tools. We got to be able to deliver things consistently in a more enterprise way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's it's interesting. You talked about the blackout times on the weekends. Those unfortunately I still see too many companies doing that, unfortunately, or their web page will go down or whatever, and there's no actual reason why. It just happens, and I mean, are we ever going to be able to move to a time when we don't have that? It seems rather, I don't know, it seems rather outdated to me to have to deal with like a blackout on a weekend or any time. I mean, it just, I don't know, maybe that's my rant for the day.
Well, I think in a way we're all becoming more modern. All of a sudden when I can get a ride on an application on my phone and I don't need to know how to call anyone. I think our expectations have changed both as, consumers as well as employees. And you're right. I think one of the important things for DevOps is, we talked about earlier about helping people understand what it means. Those are great hallmarks, for people when they think about this. You're like, hey, we're going to make our application delivery more modern. Well, what does that mean? It means that it's always available, that we're going to deliver changes in such a way that the website never, ever actually goes down. And that brings a whole new set of challenges. But if you set that as your goal, it's amazing, how resourceful people can be. And I agree with you. It's always surprising to me now where you actually do run into a particular product or a site where you're like, hey, we're down for maintenance. We'll see you at 6 a.m. And I always joke, I always say, I wish I had that much time, to deliver solutions. That'd be great having 6-7 hours. So.
Well, it's interesting also that you mentioned, kind of the changing, what our expectations changing. I think that's actually kind of key to DevOps also, because we're kind of changing the way we do business, basically, to accommodate the way customers expect us to do business.
Yeah, exactly. So now all of a sudden, instead of, almost like providing a service and saying, this is good enough for, this is what we feel like is good enough. If you're not responding to customers and their expectations, they're going to take their business elsewhere. Whether that's banking, ride sharing, or, booking a hotel, that's the world in which we live in now. And so the customer, which is a lot of fun, right? We're all consumers. We have a lot more voice at the table. And therefore, that changes the expectations that the company has to meet.
Absolutely. All right. Great. So let's take a look at our last barriers. We're doing a time check here. It's 1:42. So let's go on. The last one, the inability to convince management to invest. Foreshadowing that I did earlier today. I get it. So, this one is kind of stupid simple, right? It's self-explanatory. If you can't get management to invest in the tool, the process, even the buy-in from a culture perspective, you're doomed to failure.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think the problem with that word is if we put this slide up in front of most people, they gravitate to invest, which means, oh my goodness, what do I got to buy to get this thing done? Mm-hmm. And I think this is such a key part of success for DevOps transformation. One example that I use an awful lot when I start working with folks is I ask the question, can you tell me the cost of delivering one of your applications from development all the way through to production? And it's amazing how often the conversation starts with, well, we can tell you how much it costs, and they're really talking about just like a production release, like the Friday night update the website. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing is how often that conversation, you almost have to draw it out. You're like, okay, well, what environments does your application go through in order to, be delivered? Well, we have 5 environments and blah, blah, and people understand project timelines and those types of things. But really, when we talk about investment, we're not talking about tools and buying software. We're talking about the time and the people that are spent in each one of these environments. And then another feature of that conversation, you say, okay, well, it should take a week to get through QA, and that's, X number of people at these hours. But then you say, well, what happens if the developer happens to introduce a bug in QA? What happens then? Well, then we have to do X, Y, Z. So drawing out that information for understanding cost, it's the time and it's the people involved in the delivery across the pipeline. And you have to talk about it in two distinct ways. What happens when everything goes right? And what happens when we have to recover? And only then do you really actually get closer to a cost of application delivery. But what's funny about it is if you want to convince management that this DevOps thing is real, that, investing in a more modern delivery pattern means less errors, faster delivery, et cetera, that's a great way to do it, because now you're talking real dollars. Mm-hmm. You're like, this is what this project, this is what this transformation of this application can really look like to your company.
So how do you get to those metrics, those costs then? If you don't really have anything concrete to go by. I mean, you've got what it costs them now, but how do you get to, what it could cost them in the future using DevOps?
Sure. Well, we have a lot of information that's out there already today in terms of kind of industry standards for, what does automation actually really, like how much of an increase do you get in delivery if you, automate more of your, delivery. The other piece to it is that I think it's kind of funny, we talked about earlier, is those are the metrics that you really want to go after, right? If you say, all right, we're going to start, with this DevOps transformation for this particular app team, and we figure it's costing us, I don't know, like $100,000 a year to deliver this application change, all of the changes that we do for this application from dev to prod. So now we have at least a number that, the teams would agree on. Yep, that's about right. That's how much it costs us over the course of a year to deliver changes across the application pipeline. Well, now you have some metrics that you can go after, because you can say, okay, as we improve our delivery of that application, as, maybe we're adding continuous integration, maybe we're automating more things in the delivery pipeline. Those are the metrics that you want to go after. Most people only focus on the speed aspects, which, by the way, is very important. We also want to measure things like, have we improved in downtime? Are we, down less often? How fast can we recover? All those types of things as well. So providing those measurements as part of what you deliver as part of DevOps, that's actually really interesting, because now teams understand, what am I signing up for if I'm going to do this DevOps thing, right? These are the things I'm going to be measured on.
Okay, great. All right, I believe this is the final barrier. Not consistently ensuring continuous DevOps transformation. This is, I see this and I think of parenting. You've got to be consistent.
It's the number one thing, right?
Exactly. So yeah, I'm sorry. Being a parent, I'm totally down with this.
I'm right there with you.
Chuckling to myself. So, what do you do in this situation?
I think this is what we foreshadowed previously, which is when you're doing, when you're working through this DevOps transformation, you're changing the language of your organization. You're basically moving towards a more consistent way about talking about application delivery. And it means everybody involved. So like we used that earlier, is you don't want to provide a metric like code commits and then have the CIO start looking at a report like, hey, why did it take 20 code commits to get this thing right? You want to provide metrics that are important to your organization, but also provide a language that everybody can adhere to. So that's what we were just talking about in the last slide, which is, imagine if you start to measure the amount of time it takes you to recover for the delivery of an application, and not just in production, right? Imagine your QA team, if they had a voice at the table. If you ask a lot of QA teams today, most organizations are like, oh my goodness, we did a deployment and, on Monday it was fine, but then on Wednesday it took us 3.5 hours, right? So for one, it's inconsistent. Two, they don't have visibility to what's happening. And three, those metrics are what's going to give us the feedback for what we have to change. Right? There's a good area, for example, to go after as we iterate through this, is to say, okay, how do we get more consistency in our delivery from the first step, from dev to QA? So I think having metrics that the entire, organization is going to use to talk about it, as well as making sure that people are adhering to those metrics, like, and if they're not working, then let's use that as feedback to make changes there as well.
One thing I think that maybe hasn't been discussed as much is kind of that negative connotation sometimes that DevOps can bring. It's always, we talk about things like stand-ups where you have like the fail fast and the blameless postmortems and things like that, but there always kind of seems to be this I don't know, an element of negativity that kind of, everybody thinks that something negative is going to happen with when you implement DevOps, like you're going to lose their job or somebody's going to get blamed for something, or, I think DevOps kind of needs to be approached more from a positive aspect as, the benefits to the organization, the benefits to you as an employee, the benefits to the end user customer. I'm not sure. I feel like when I hear about DevOps, sometimes people talking about it, there just seems to be this undercurrent of negativity, regarding what can't be done or what's going to happen that's not exactly positive to the, to the particular person who's talking about it. Am I wrong? I mean, is that just me, or is it something you've seen out there also?
To be honest, I think you're spot on. I see it an awful lot as well. It's one thing to publish metrics, but I don't know if I've worked on dev teams where we had, a radiator board up and it was the who broke the build view. And so nobody wanted to be the person that made a commit to break the build. But guess what ended up happening? If you don't have a good culture around that, all of a sudden people are afraid to make changes. And man, oh man, you talk about, putting barriers in your delivery process. So I think you're right. Focusing on the positives is such a critical factor of success. The ability for people to understand not only what's changing, but how is that impacting them in a positive way. It's just so important, right? Like a stand-up each day isn't about like why we're running late. A stand-up needs to be about what am I doing today? What's blocking me? And where do I need help? So then your teammates get to come in and do those types of things. So I think and even just publicizing metrics, to your point, even the spin on those metrics need to be such that people understand, like, hey, we're not doing as well. Maybe we're not doing as well today. But what are we going to do to make that, change? What are we going to change in our process to make it better? Rather than the other, which you spoke of, like people like, oh my goodness, if this keeps up, I'm going to be on the street. So I think keeping positive is so important. You're right.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. So, at the end of the day, I mean, it all, we're talking about improving processes, people, and tools to make sure that to create a cohesive and complete DevOps environment. So, I imagine there are barriers in everything, but in DevOps especially, it really can make or break the success of a DevOps implementation.
Exactly. And I think looking at and understanding your entire delivery process is so critical as part of all of this to make sure that, you understand the delivery pipeline.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I am going to actually go back into, I'm trying to get to my, my GoToMeeting thing. I don't know what happened to it.
Do you want me to go through the questions there? I can see. I have mine on the little set. Yeah.
Oh, wait, there it is. I got it. Never mind.
You got it? Okay.
Yep. Cool. Let me go back in. There we go. All right. So questions. Let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got a question from Ananth who asks, do we have DevOps coaches? Is that a thing in markets?
I'm actually seeing that in two ways, actually. I see that as people, branding themselves and being able to market themselves in that way to actually create consulting engagements as well as more full-time type, opportunities, just like there was, there's agile coaches and those types of things. So yes to that. I also see that as a particular feature of the Center of Excellence concept that I talked about, that kind of centralized area where people can bring that across their organization. So there's companies that I've been at where they'll have people where they have these types of certifications. So they have their quote day job, but they also can work on separately on terms of projects to go over to other teams and contribute there. So definitely coaching opportunities out there for that.
All right, great. Got a question here, a really interesting one from Kumar. He says, version control is sometimes an overlooked area. Is that something we should look at on how the code should be organized before investing in DevOps tools or before starting the journey?
It's funny, isn't it? Version control is a key part of the developer, toolkit, as well as the language in which they speak. And so when I talk about like the dev to prod pipeline, that's where I see a lot of developers are focusing their times and energy. So version control, first and foremost, is critical, right? You need that as part of a modern delivery. But I don't think actually it's a blocker before you start. It actually would be the area where your developers are going to focus some time and energy, like we've been talking about, as well as probably some metrics around what changes they're making as part of this overall delivery. Getting things versioned, getting a branching strategy that works for delivering changes more effectively. Those things will actually change over time as well. So I don't see it as a blocker, something that you have to solve first, but I definitely see it as an area for development to kind of publicize, to say, hey, here's where we're at today, here's our part of the journey, and this is what we're measuring to get better.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one or two more questions here. Let's see. Okay, got another one from Ananth, actually. How much, it says, how much tools are important in DevOps? So how important are tools in DevOps?
Well, obviously, they're important in the terms of, they're one of the key areas in which you're going to solve a lot of your problems. But as I always say, we talk people, process, tools. I guess that means that tools play about a 1/3 part of the overall.
Right.
So they're definitely important, right? I think what people tend to focus on tools too much is because that's the easier area to solve. So like I'll sit down at the table with the development team, and a lot of them will start talking about their different, source code systems and which one's the better one, and this is why, and those types of things. Well, that's important for sure as part of their, particular area. But when we're talking about DevOps, we're talking about the entire delivery pipeline. Your business tester at the other end of the pipe, they're not necessarily as concerned about which tools you use to build the software. What they want to know is what you build is consistently what they expect, to receive. So I think tools has a voice at the table for sure, and it's an ongoing part of the conversation. It shouldn't be the most important thing. There's two other key areas that you have to make sure you're addressing as part of this overall transformation.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that tools are kind of the easiest conversation to have because it's more, it's a physical thing basically. You can wrap your brain around tools, but it's not as easy to kind of figure out how to change culture and how to change processes to really get people on board. So in that respect, are there certain things that companies can do to kind of help them down that path of the people and processes part of DevOps?
Yeah, for sure. So I think of it as if we're going to talk tooling, I think the most important thing is to understand how that tooling integrates and impacts the different teams in the delivery pipeline. So if you think about, like, if you're an organization with a typical, like a dev, a QA, a pre-prod, and prod, each of those environments, there's teams there that have roles and responsibilities within them, those phases of delivery. And so when you talk about tooling, that's, I guess, my key advice is you need to understand how does that tooling impact them and how does it help them? How does it integrate within their process to actually help them transform?
Yeah, so everything is interconnected, basically. You can't think about processes without thinking about people and tools, and you can't think about people without thinking about processes and tools, and you can't think about tools without thinking about people and processes. So, yeah.
You just invented the first DevOps icebreaker. We're gonna use that at the next conference. Have
Awesome.
Everybody stand up and say that 3 times fast.
I love it. I love it. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the questions. But thank you, everybody who did send in some questions. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sure that TJ will be more than happy to follow up with you post-event. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will be receiving an email post-event with a link to listen to it and watch it on demand. Also, as a reminder that you are going to be receiving a link to the ebook that goes along with this webinar. It's the same name, 7 All Too Common Barriers to Successful DevOps Transformation and How to Overcome Them. You can also access that ebook on the DevOps.com website, where we have a ton of other ebooks. Also, you can check out the webinar on demand on the DevOps.com website. And we also have a ton of other webinars that are coming up. So take a look at those and see if there's something that piques your interest. TJ Randall, thank you so much for taking the time today and having the discussion with me. I had a great time.
I did too, Charlene. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time. This is Charlene O'Hanlon signing off. Have a great day.